This is number 4 in a series. I decided to do a series of 5 on this idea of attachment and codependency. For me, the two are very much intertwined. Also, trauma is intertwined in there too. So we'll do a quick review of some of the previous. So I have quite a few slides in here that are from the previous webinars. So if you don't know or didn't see those previous webinars, it's fine. You can go back and look at the other ones too. Or if you have questions, just let me know. So I usually will do a quick review of what we talked about the week or two before, or the webinar or two before. And so that was basically supportive versus enabling behaviors. That was number 2. The number 1, if you weren't there, was a history, kind of my idea of the history of attachment theory. Supportive versus enabling behaviors, then the change process and boundaries were the last 2. And today, I'm going to talk a little bit about communication and just boundary setting itself with people who were struggling with their substance use. And just sort of that idea of how do we start changing our communication with the people that we care about that aren't really doing what we want them to do, which is kind of really the basis for a lot of the angst in people that have loved ones who are in addiction, active addiction at least. And sometimes people might be clean or sober, but not really in a state of recovery. That could make them difficult to be with too. The last webinar that I'll do in this series, and I'll probably repeat this series too, by the way, will be on August 11th. I postponed it for a couple of weeks because of some scheduling issues. It was originally on July 28th, but we'll do that on August 11th at 6 p.m. So that last one will be on relapse prevention. As we kind of go through this thing, you'll see that I look at most everything from a relapse lens. And so just like an addict wants to prevent the relapse of drugs and alcohol, a person who's got attachment or codependent sort of struggles is also trying to prevent a relapse of maybe enabling or overhelping or something like that. So I kept this, this is sort of a chronological reading list of what I did in the first webinar. You can go back and take a peek at that. I love this idea of co-recovery. I don't know if I invented it, but I really like the idea that both people in the relationship need to have this sense of co-recovery. And I sort of stole that from codependency, obviously. But many people who struggle with people who relapse really have a hard time looking at themselves. And so I started this little, and this is from a previous presentation as well, but I put a star by this. We need to make an effort to reorganize and evolve our relationship with our loved one from a parent-child relationship to an adult-adult relationship. And that's kind of the basis for today. And if anybody knows that idea of parent-child and not okay child, nurturing parent, critical parent, that's straight out of transactional analysis. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. So as I move down here, this is also from a previous talk just about this idea that challenge and support needs to be matched. Too much challenge and not enough support isn't good, and too much support and not enough challenge isn't good for growth. So I'm always kind of keeping an eye on the level of challenge I'm giving to myself or maybe to another client, and or the level of support, and making sure that there's a comfortable match in there. So it's just something that I kind of keep this in here as just a reminder. So some of this review, last time we talked about boundaries, and so there's some positive effects of boundaries, and here's sort of some of the effects of when people have difficulty with boundaries or they have unbalanced challenge and support. And so you can go and review these things. A couple of these slides next to are also, I just left them in there for reference. People in my past wanted some straight up contrasts of enabling versus supportive behaviors. And so this is sort of my collection of supportive enabling behaviors. There's 2 slides on this, and I think the one here that sticks out to me is this one right here, this idea of the belief that they can recover. So once I lose hope that that person can recover, it really has an effect on our relationship. And while I always endorse being authentic, it's important to bring that sense of hope for people, because that not only comes off in the relationship, but it helps me to hold course as well. And this next slide is continuing on that. So, and today we're going to be talking sort of about actually applying appropriate and healthy boundaries with some of the language that we use. And this other one, being willing to say no. So I always look at this as recovery behaviors versus relapse behaviors. And so that's in a nutshell how I frame this. So I know you'll all have these things. So basically, here's our enabling behaviors, which I would frame as relapse behaviors or living in the problem. So there's a kind of a saying, it's in the rooms of the 12-step programs, that you're either living in the problem or you're living in the solution. And so I want to avoid living in the problem here. So avoiding conflict, denial of the problem, criticism, blame, judgment of others and self. And you can tell that a lot of these things that are relapse or behaviors that cause me to live in the problem are external for the most part. And if I go to the next one, where it's recovery behaviors or living in the solution, you can look at some of these things and really realize that a lot of them are internally motivated. So really, for me, if I go back, you know, this relapse behavior is really an external focus, and the recovery behaviors are an internal focus. And that's the problem with a lot of codependents, because their codependency is typically, not always, but it's typically based in some type of trauma. And so the way I take care of a trauma, which results in a crippling fear, typically, right? Sorry, I wonder how I guess it's okay the way it is. My solution to that crippling fear is I need to control my external forces as best I can, and that makes me feel safe and helps me to calm myself down. So really looking inward, and this is so a lot of people that struggle with these traits is that they're always trying to control their external situation rather than their internal situation. And I just saw from Gerald, yeah, the questions in this chat box would be great, because that's the one that I have open. Thanks, Gerald. And so you can tell that this is sort of it's an inside-out problem, not an outside-in problem. I keep this slide in there because I always want to remind everybody and myself that incremental change is usually the type of change that lasts the longest. It's not that an epiphanal change would be good, because we know we have those types of things, but most often the incremental, a little bit of change at a little bit of time, over time, is much more indicative of a long-term change than something that happens all of a sudden. This little primer here for addiction treatment by White and Kurtz is a great resource. So today, that change process, we're going to kind of sit in these 2 parts of the Prochaska Di Clemente model. So I'm going to skip down here. Here's that model that I did before. It's kind of a circular or a spiral shaped model, really, that pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, action, relapse. Right now, we're going to sit in this contemplation and preparation area. So just like an addict would say, hey, maybe I need to change my using, a person that struggles with attachment or codependency needs to identify what that trait is that they're trying to change. And so it could be any one of these things: enabling boundaries, self-care, trauma response. So I need to really own that I want to make a change. And then I need to prepare how I'm going to make that change before I make it. And addicts and codependents tend to want things fixed fairly quickly, and they don't have a lot of patience. So it takes preparation, and basically we're in that preparation stage right now of just sort of gathering information and thinking about how I might do this. I have kind of a 3-step process that I like to go through: awareness, willingness, and then self-intervention. And yeah, Gerald, as we go there, sorry, one can go from one stage to another, return to recovery, not necessarily in pre-com. Yeah, yeah, we're going to look at that, Gerald, in a minute, about how that process works. But you're right. What we're trying to do, so for me, a person really needs to be aware of what's going on with their emotional state, with their attachment, with their expectations, and then they have to be willing to intervene with a different coping strategy than they used to intervene with. So for an addict, of course, that behavior would be using. For a codependent, that would be a version of enabling or overhelping or overloving or something like that. So awareness, willingness, self-intervention. So as I move down here, there's a kind of a cycle of these. And as Gerald said, one can relapse and return to recovery. But in the stages of change, after one relapses, this is what I encourage people not to get caught up in. Not to get caught up in this bounce back and forth between relapse and action. Well, I'll try again tomorrow, so I try again, then I make the same mistake again, and then I go to relapse, and I'm back and forth. So this is what drives everyone crazy when they're trying to watch someone make a change, because what's missing in this idea is that they don't need to go, or they oughtn't not to go from relapse to action, but they need to go relapse back to preparation. And they need to prepare for what they missed, right? And then they try again. And then they might still have a relapse, and they just go back and forth until, and so here's some of the questions that we ask, so for a codependent, they might ask, why did I not hold my boundaries? Why did I enable? Why did I give my son or daughter, wife, husband money when I said I wouldn't? So the planning or preparation stage is what's really important for a person to return to, because that's where the practice is. And I always go back to, I've got to look at what I missed and re-prepare and then re-engage. What's missing is meaning. I don't know if I know exactly what you mean by that, Gerald. Yeah, that's going a little bit deeper, but of course, if you refer to, well, and that's part of attitude, when the person relapses or stumbles, they need to take it as a learning experience and an opportunity to grow. And instead of just giving up and going back to the old behaviors, but that's part of this preparation. What did I miss? Maybe I didn't have meaning. What can I do differently? Well, I can share with other people that I'm struggling, or what wasn't I prepared for, and how can I improve? So I'm always asking those questions, So the whole idea for me is, I don't want to end up doing this relapse preparation action cycle over and over and over. At some point, the cycle turns to a maintenance, and so I'm going into preparation, action, and then eventually I don't really go back into relapses. I go into this maintenance phase and my idea of relapse changes. So I don't, maybe as an alcoholic or a drug addict, I don't go use again, or as a codependent, I'm not enabling, but I'm catching myself earlier in the process so that I can go back and re-prepare for something that was leading me to a relapse rather than going to the whole relapse. So then at some point, a person comes out of it. And after, and these years are fairly well accepted, but, it seems like a long time, but transitioning through these stages, remember from the last time, it's not it's not like, oh, when you go from preparation to action, there's kind of a definitive sort of step, because you're like, okay, tomorrow I'm going to try this. But going from action into maintenance is much less of a definite step into, right? So that maintenance phase just starts to happen, and the recovery behaviors start to become innate, just like the problem behaviors became innate before. So it's just a little reminder of how this change process works, right? And then I also think of this, I put this spiral on here because there really is no, it's not like a person relapses and then they go kerplunk back to the bottom. It's a growing process. So if I go back over here to this relapse slide, when I relapse and I go back to preparation, I actually don't go back to the same level of preparation, because I don't really have to re-prepare for what I've already prepared for. I have to prepare for what I missed, right? So I go to a little higher level of preparation, and eventually you end up doing this maintenance cycle, and eventually you internalize all the behaviors, and you end up exiting the model. So that's a quick review. Let me see here. I'm reading Gerald's comment in your relapses, not fully accepting that my family dynamics don't change. And I think that's an important statement, because which is going to lead to this transactional analysis talk, is that when people get out of treatment, because they've done all this work, doesn't mean the family dynamics have changed. And if a person who struggles with codependency goes and does all this work, and they make all of these changes, and they go back to the family may not have changed. So no matter what angle you're looking at recovery from, you can't expect that things are going to change just because you made these changes. And this is what slips people up. So that's why I go back to this slide here of, what did I miss? Well, I expected my family to be better because I was better. Well, that's not really fair to them, because I can't expect that they're going to do the work as well. And so that happens from both directions. So as I go down here, I kind of get into this talk about sort of personality style and this communication piece. And so I'm trying to keep an eye on time too. So Eric Barron came out with this theory of transactional analysis somewhere in the mid-60s. And it was something that they used in elementary schools, and I still use it. And the reason that I still use it is because it's simple and it's understandable, and I can apply it pretty easily. So, and you can look up TA, you can actually Google PAC, and you'll probably have tons of resources. So I'm looking at Taylor. Can preparation for dealing with dishonesty? That's actually a great question. Let me get through this a little bit and then come back to it, because we might have some answers as we go forward. Steve, if you can help me not to remember not to miss that before we go. So what Eric Barron says is we have these three ego states, right? We have a parent, we have an adult, we have a child. And these ego states are present in everybody at every age. So what are these things? Well, we have this child part of us that is very impulsive, humorous, likes to have fun, happy-go-lucky. It's that part of us that enjoys playing, right? And then we have a parent part of us that likes to take care of us, likes to nurture, likes to hold us accountable. And then we have this part of us that, and both the parent and the child are, how do I want to put it, fairly emotionally driven. The adult is the least emotionally driven piece. So I describe it as kind of the Mr. Spock from Star Trek. It's a little more logical, but everybody knows that Mr. Spock wasn't that fun to hang around for the most part. And so if you can see the little parts where these diagrams intersect with an appropriate part of the child. So when you think about the people you like to hang around, they have an appropriate part of boundaries that a parent might have, and they have an appropriate amount of childlike qualities that makes them fun to be around, right, and interesting. So if it was just a straight up adult with no emotion, that wouldn't be a very enjoyable relationship, most likely. So these three different egos, we have these three different ego states that we operate from. So this kind of goes in a little bit deeper that he talks about we actually have two parts of a parent and two parts of a child. So the parent can be split into these two other ego states, where one is the nurturing parent that is very supportive and loving and caring, of course, and the other one is the critical parent. And then the child is split into two parts also, the okay child and then what he called the not okay child. So if we dig into what those traits are, for the nurturing parent, very loving, very understanding, forgiving, usually dependable, and supportive, non-judgmental, caring, of course. And the okay child, confident, happy, playful, loving, calm, resilient, respectful, right? And then you look at the critical parent and the not okay child, and those traits look like, for a critical parent, so I think of kind of like an angry mother or father figure. Very demanding, very controlling, very judging, condescending, stern, blaming, and moody. And you can see how these traits could be fed by a traumatic experience in someone's past. Same as the not okay child, defensive, moody, selfish, closed off, resistant, manipulative, non-compliant, and demanding. So these are my own constructions that I've put in here. So whenever I do this talk, and so I usually do this on a whiteboard or a chalkboard, and I have the group members brainstorm these traits with me. And so the reason that I put it up like this is that whenever we brainstorm for a nurturing parent, they're usually positive. And whenever we brainstorm for a critical parent, they're usually negative. And the same thing for the okay child and the not okay child. When they think about the okay child, they usually think of positive traits. And when they think of the not okay child, they think of negative traits. And yeah, so it could be. And so what occurred, it could be what Gerald said is that I know the traits are when needs are met and on the left, and when needs are not met, on the right. And that could be part of it. And of course, when needs are not met, that's when the trauma response happens. But it's more of this idea that what do I think about people that are like this, right? So my perception of a nurturing parent and my perception of a critical parent. So when we're brainstorming these ideas, our preconceptions are already coming out. And so it occurred to me that maybe a critical parent doesn't always have negative traits. Maybe they have some positive traits. And usually when I'm brainstorming this with a group, somebody will shout out and they'll raise their hand and they'll say, but maybe not all the traits of a nurturing parent are positive. And I'll say, well, maybe you're right. So then we brainstorm the opposite for each one. Hold on a second, I got things kind of mixed up here. So if I think about the positive traits of a critical parent, they are very loving. A person can be critical and loving at the same time. They're a guiding force in someone's life. They're also dependable. Notice how dependable is on both sides. And these words that I have here, by the way, are words that were brainstormed with a group. So I didn't just put these words up here. This is what somebody came up with as we were processing the positive and negative traits. So this isn't in a book. This is from a group process and discussion. Honest, also for critical parent, very discerning, right? So they see the details, which a lot of times you can tell addicts don't like, but also very supportive, which you can tell is on both sides. And then for the negative traits of the nurturing parent, this is actually where you start seeing the codependent nature of a person that is struggling. Enabling, of course, controlling, and they do that by spoiling a person. They will spoil a child. And by the way, when I talk about a child, I use that as a metaphoric example, not necessarily a literal example, because there are partnerships and coupleships where one person is treated like a child, right? So one person gets spoiled in order to control that person. They dote, they smother, and they're also fearful, right? They do those things, they do those controlling behaviors because they're fearful of what might happen if they don't. And they become very dependent that the person they're trying to control through their doting and spoiling and overhelping stays in need of them. So that's where the idea of codependency comes from. They become codependent on the other person. So a codependent needs a dependent. And if I look at the negative traits, if I go down to this, the negative traits of an okay child, so everybody thinks, well, an okay child is okay, their needs are met. And that's actually what Barron says. You know, he doesn't go this far into it typically. So this is sort of my, as I said, construction of, you know, like maybe there's some negative traits. And I think okay children can have negative traits of dependency, right? They tend to rely on their caregiver. They're helpless, and they may even become or sort of have this trait of learned helplessness. So learned helplessness, they might just believe that they are not able, and the parent exactly wants that to happen. They want them to think that they're always in need, so then that codependent parent always has a job. So there's this very cyclical relationship that happens. An okay child can be gullible, impulsively, and weak. And then I look over at the positive traits of this not okay child. Not okay children tend to be fairly independent. They tend to be fairly self-directed. They learn to be that way because they're very resilient and very sensitive. So I can be not okay and still be very resilient and sensitive, and I can be self-directed. A lot of times you might see this in sort of single children, you know, only children become very, very self-directed and independent in how they operate in their life. I'm just checking out Gerald's comment. Yeah. This is how I look at this. It's very much, for me, this, every time I do this, there's somebody will bring up something in this, and this is kind of like the crux of where I operate from with people. And so if I go back to this page up here where I'm trying to become aware of how I am. And so this is that inside out work, right? I have to be aware of how I'm responding, feeling, behaving in a certain situation in order to be willing to put myself in somehow into this change process. So if I'm not aware of where I'm at in some of these models, then I'm really dead in the water. So it's really this, and I repeat this a lot, it's compassionate self-reflection. You know, it's taking a moment, where am I at right now? What am I afraid of is a question I ask people a lot. And so how does this apply to transactions? Because basically we're just looking at one person here, right? So there's not really a transaction happening. It's just sort of, okay, here's the groundwork of what I see in this model and what might be helpful. So I have to add a person in. So here are the two people with a nurturing parent, critical parent, not okay child. And then here's the loved one, whether it's a child, mother, father, brother, sister, it doesn't matter. So I start to look at, and this is what Baron was doing, was looking at, excuse me, what do these transactions look like? And what are they based in? And we're not going to go into anything as deep as he goes, but I will tell you that, and I think I have it in this next, a lot of this comes from this transactional analysis primer down here that you can take a peek at and probably order. I will show you a picture of it right here. I have to put my face in front of it, otherwise it won't. So there's the transactional analysis primer. So Baron, if anybody knows this stuff or is familiar with it, I always tell them there's a book called Games People Play, and there's another book from the late 60s, I think, mid 70s, called I'm Okay, You're Okay. And most people have kind of heard of that book or those two books. And so Baron started analyzing what are these little games that people play. And so here's just some of the ideas to be aware of. He called this one, Now See What You Made Me Do, which is essentially unfairly accusing someone of causing a mistake you made, then using their response as evidence that you are blameless, right? So it's a way to not take ownership, and that's a big part of what I do with people, is like, all of this is about taking ownership about what is my stuff. Whether I'm on the addiction side of the coin or the codependency side of the coin, doesn't really matter. I still have to do this compassionate self-reflection and take ownership. And people ask, kind of that question about lying. How do you deal with lying? By taking ownership. Taking ownership diffuses combative situations. If it weren't for you, complaining to someone that they don't, I have to read this a little slower, complaining to someone that they don't let you do what you want, believing you're justified in your grievance, and at the same time, the child part of you can be secretly asking for help to avoid doing what you say you want because you're afraid you might fail. That's a complicated, twisted way that people play games, right? If it weren't for you, I would get sober, for example. But what I'm really saying is, I'm afraid that I'm not going to be able to be sober on my own. So I'm very unconfident about it. And so in order to navigate that, I blame it on someone else if it weren't for you. Right? So that's basically an addict not taking ownership. So you can see these games are all about not taking ownership. Kick me, inviting criticism to confirm or support a pre-existing not okay belief. Yeah, I'm stupid. I really did a bad thing. I'm a horrible person. Tell me how horrible I am, right? So these are very much manipulative ways to not take ownership. So if I'm doing something like that, I'm actually doing something that happens a lot, I believe, is that I invite this criticism from somebody outside of me, knowing that whatever criticism they give me will in no way compare to the criticism I've already given myself. So I've already protected myself from being hurt by anyone's criticism because of the punishment I've already given myself. So then it's okay to invite it, feel safe to invite it, if that makes sense. So I'm going to go back down here. So this is the one that I kind of charted out a little bit. This is kind of a tit for tat sort of game. So one person is, I'm only trying to help, and the other person is, now see what you made me do. So this is sort of a classic codependent dependent relationship. the parent or the loved one of the addict is saying, I'm only trying to help, but they're offering help when they actually believe the person is hopeless. And so that's where it goes back to those beliefs. So I have to really look at my attitudes and beliefs and go back to those previous webinars about what am I attached to here? What is it that I want? What is it that I'm afraid of? Because I'm only trying to help. And I say that because if I believe the person is hopeless, then it's okay that my help doesn't help. But also, if they're hopeless, if you think about it, they stay in need of me. So part of me wants to believe they're hopeless because it helps to promote that cycle of need from the other person. And of course, the other person says, now see what you made me do. So asking for help when they believe they are helpless themselves. So there's that sense of learned helplessness. So how does this play out is we get into this idea of which ego state am I communicating from? And so this is the crux of this whole thing. What ego state am I communicating from? And it doesn't matter whether I'm the codependent person or the person that's struggling with substance use. I have to assess where I'm coming from. And so this one is now see what you made me do. So if you think about it, that person might say, see what happens when you distract me, see what happens when you ignore me or you try to control me. And to me, that ego state, if you think about it, where are they coming from? It's most likely a not okay position because there are some needs that aren't getting met, right? There's a trauma that's been activated. Something has happened where they're discontent and they're not able to take ownership, so they want to blame someone else. So they talk to their caregiver, their parent, their child, their husband, their wife, whatever. And they say, see what happens when you try to control me. Or see what happens when you ignore me or when you distract me. In other words, whatever happened to me is not my fault, it's yours. And so what that is inviting is a response from another ego state that is the counterpart of the one that it's coming from. And so most often, so you can see this not okay child comes from, tries to elicit a critical parent. And then of course the response back is, see what happens when you don't listen to what I say. So the critical parent goes straight back and responds in kind, right? And so I call this the ping pong match. So this is what happens a lot in addictive families is the person says, well, you're horrible because you're relapsed. And the person says, yeah, you're right. Well, why did you do it? I don't know. And it's this ping pong match between critical parent and not okay child. And they're both not taking ownership and they're both not getting their needs met. And so they escalate the conversation. And then of course it turns into, sometimes something pretty traumatic. And in kind, a critical or a nurturing parent elicits an okay child, and an okay child elicits a nurturing parent. But what ends up happening in that is that we end up what I call crossed transactions. So here's the critical parent eliciting the not okay child and vice versa, right? And the nurturing parent eliciting the okay child and vice versa. So I never get a sense of an adult to adult conversation that's less emotionally driven with the appropriate level of nurturing critical parent and the appropriate level of okay, not okay child mixed into my adult self. So this is the work that addictive families or families with addiction throughout them have to do, right? They have to be aware of what ego state they're operating from. And those are the questions of usually, what am I afraid of? What am I attached to? One of those two. Or, what trauma is. And if there's a trauma that's been instigated, then it's like, what trauma am I trying to solve and how am I trying to distract myself from the trauma? So it's a really interesting, so for me, this is sort of going on for me all the time when I'm working for people. So there's the nuts and bolts. So what's the bottom line? The actual task in this whole thing is somehow I have to pull myself into this adult state and somehow out of this overbearing child state, right? I have to get from nurturing parent into adult, which is part of that boundary setting, and critical parent into adult, or not okay into adult. So I do that by changing my language that I'll go over here in a minute. But basically, if I do this, I will throw out these adult conversations. And one of the most common ones that we've all heard is the if then or when you statements. When you dot dot dot, I feel dot dot dot. So that's sort of, for me, it's a little bit of a lame attempt at trying to be an adult, right? Because it's too clinical. But trying to be honest and authentic and take ownership. So I usually flip them around. When you drank last night, I felt very afraid. And I stop there. I don't go on a diatribe. I don't add any more on, and I'll talk later about how those conversations go. But it's very difficult to stop a conversation and not go into an entire explanation of why I felt afraid, right? So just because I state an adult message, it doesn't mean I'm going to get an adult message back. So back to the question about just because a person gets sober or a codependent works on their enabling traits doesn't mean the family's going to get better. So just because all of a sudden I'm saying these adult statements doesn't mean anything is going to change. So I have to have this sense of rapid fire. So I have to just adult. No matter what comes back at me, no matter what they say to me, no matter how they criticize me, I have to stay in my adult mode. I have to stay in, and this is probably the hardest task to do. And I tell people that, so usually I will do a demonstration with a group when I do this talk. And I'll just ask for a volunteer, or maybe I'll pick somebody if they're comfortable, if they wanted to role play with me. And then I ask them to be a not okay child. And I ask them to try to stay in the not okay child. And then I role play out with them as either their father, their mother, their uncle, something like that. And when I'm doing this, I don't tell them what to say. And we sort of make up the problem in the moment. And I just go with it. And then I get very transparent with people, because even now talking about it, I can tell that my heart rate starts to go up because I get a little bit nervous. Because even though it's a role play, I still get nervous. And so I ask myself, what am I attached to? And maybe I'm attached to doing a really good job. What am I afraid of? Or, well, I'm attached to being seen as a good therapist or an intelligent person in the group member's eyes. I get very attached to that. And I ask, what am I afraid of? And I'm afraid of not doing a good job. I'm afraid of failing, or I'm afraid that there's going to be something that comes up that I'm not prepared for. And I don't always trust that I can think on my feet. So even just reminiscing about that now, about some of those moments, I'm having those memories of some of those groups that were very difficult. But the fact is I've never not been able to do it. I've never not been able to get through a conversation or make something therapeutic about it. So the fear is completely unfounded. That doesn't stop it from coming up, though. So my job is to be aware that it's coming up and to be willing to intervene in some other way than I used to intervene to take care of my fear. And then I self-intervene by doing some breathing exercises, doing some positive self-talk, etc. So it's a way for me to stay in that moment. And persevere. And so far with this, we've had a person and their loved one right? We've been talking about two different people. But then at the end of this talk, I always tell there's one relationship that we should probably start with first. So my relationship that I have with myself is determinant of more of my behaviors than the relationship I have with other people. And this is sometimes something that gets skipped over. And I know most therapists are just going, yeah, of course, this is an important relationship. But this is actually the relationship that I believe we should assess first. Because how do I talk to myself? Do I tell myself that I'm a failure? Do I tell myself, I just said a minute ago, I was afraid of being a failure, afraid of not being seen as intelligent. And so these are the conversations I'm having with myself inside my own head. And that's what's informing my trauma response. It's what's informing my defensive response, my controlling response, my enabling responses. And so this, to me, is really the main part. So all of this prior stuff is to understand this model, but I think this is really where the work is on this slide. So I'm going to leave it at that. I know we have about 10 minutes, so I'm just going to kind of run through these other slides because they're a repeat, and then we can make sure that I get to the questions. So communication suggestions to begin setting gradual boundaries. So what I would say is remember the work we've already done, so this is what's been in previous webinars. I need to identify what am I willing to do and what am I not willing to do, right? And you can make your own list. I have suggestions here as far as, of course, these are things that I came up with myself and with other groups, but I am not willing to sacrifice my well-being for another. I'm not willing to avoid the problem. That's a tough one for some people that struggle with trauma. Because part of the way they solve the trauma is to avoid the problem, avoid touching that problem, and avoid getting close to it. I'm not willing to rescue, make choices. That's another one. So I am willing to, though, experience some discomfort in this process and communicating that with your loved one. And going back to the question about lying, that could be a way to do it. So if I think about living in the solution instead of the problem, if someone's lying to me, I let go of my expectations that they're going to tell me the truth. I let them know that I'm okay to experience some discomfort in this relationship, and I'm not going to let them, what they say to me, affect my well-being. I'm willing to face conflict, and I'm not going to judge that person for lying to me, because if I think about it long enough, I know that they're only lying as a result of a fear they have. I won't always tell that to them outwardly, but instead of saying you're lying to me, I can say, okay, I can respect what you said, and I'm willing to experience some discomfort in this process as we learn how to be authentic with each other. And in that, being authentic and just saying, that makes me uncomfortable. I feel uncomfortable when you lie. And so here are some feeling statements, but I sort of put them here. These are some of the things that that I sort of rely on. These are the ones I rely on the most. So this slide before is from a previous talk. These are things I'm sort of asking myself. But these are the ones that I really rely on, is help me understand what's going on. If somebody's lying, so I'm kind of got that lying question. Did I miss anything, Steve, as I go? Trying to think, that was one of the other questions. But so I have the how do you deal with dishonesty and handling dishonesty? So that's what's in my head as I go through these. I'm thinking, how do I have an adult statement here? Help me understand what's going on with you. And then I stop and I don't add anything else. And this is the trouble that I learned as a therapist, is don't talk too much, even though I've been talking this whole time. But this, I love you, and That's directly out of Love First, which is kind of an interventionist handbook by, I believe it's John and Deborah J. Please forgive me if I didn't cite that properly. The whole idea is I love you and is unconditional love. If I say I love you, but you're still using, that's conditional love. If I say I love you and you're still using, that's unconditional love. Because I can love you and you can use at the same time. I'm not going to like it, but it doesn't change the fact that I love you. Otherwise, most most families would be broken up long before they are, right? So I always try to say I love you and then I keep my reflection short. I feel blank, and I put in here just a one-word feeling. I feel disappointed when you relapse. And then I stop. I don't go into some diatribe and say, because I was worried about you all night or whatever, right? Keep it very simple. When somebody asks me for help and I think they have this sense of learned helplessness and they want me to solve their problem so they don't have to do any work or take ownership that they need to do some work, I'll just simply ask them, what have you tried so far? Hey, Mom, I need money for rent. Interesting. What have you tried so far? Well, I've called you. Well, that sounds like a great idea. I'm glad you did that. What do you plan on trying next? And I might stay on that track until they realize, and what I'm doing is I'm slowly drawing the boundary and sending them the message that I'm not intending to give them any money for rent. So what have you tried so far? I don't know. What do you think I should do? That's a good question. What do you come up with? You know, so I challenge people to use their own intelligence to solve their problems. And then, of course, just a validation of just saying, you know, hey, I need some rent money. Wow, that sounds horrible. And then I stop. And it's really hard for a codependent to stop there. I know we're getting close to time, but, and this last thing, this is one of the things I learned in my first counseling class, probably the first 2 weeks of my counseling career. The teacher put this up on the board. Her name was Nathalie Keys. I've never forgotten it, and I'm still working on it. She said, take these words out of your vocabulary if you can. Could, would, should, ought, and change it to I want. Instead of you should be sober, you could say I want you to be sober. Because it's a much less shaming way to talk to somebody. So I want to sort of take these shaming words out of my language, especially when I'm talking to myself as well. I could have been on time, but, right? So replace could, would, should, ought with the words I want, and then take out the word but and replace it with the word and I always make a joke because once I tell groups and clients this, then they start watching me. And the reason I say this is not necessarily, the intention is not necessarily that I want you to be less shaming, but what happens when I'm changing my language? If you just noticed, I did it because I noticed I said the word but. It slowed me down. It slows my thinking down and it slows my language down. So I'm not just saying something off the cuff. I actually have to think. And when a partner or a loved one sees me in the middle of maybe a heated conversation and they see me hesitate and not say what I would normally do because I'm trying to reframe my language, that will clue them in that I'm doing work in that moment. And I always tell people, if you're taking ownership and doing work, that's the most supportive thing you can do for your loved one, and vice versa. And so with that, I will ride off into the sunset. Any questions or comments? I know, sorry, I'm going to roll down here. Thank you for choosing to be vulnerable. You're welcome. I kind of learned not being transparent didn't ever really serve me very well. So I kind of let it out when that happens. Recognizing changes, increased emotional intelligence. Yeah. Emotional maturity, increased emotional maturity, finding meaning, transcending past by accepting. Is there anybody that has questions or a comment before we sign off? I'm going to stop the share for a second. Is there one on there? Oh,
I think you got all the ones that have been asked so far.
Oh, I see. There's one in the question, the Q&A section. Do I see sexual habits? Someone's asking, do I see sexual habits by individuals as addictions? I hate to use this, but I mean, it depends. It depends on the intention. It depends on how they're doing it and what's going on. But yeah, I think sexual habits can become an addiction. I mean, the dopamine response that happens when an orgasm happens, I mean, that's what everybody's looking for anyway. That's what happens when we drink or use cocaine or any other drug. It's definitely a neurotransmitter response. It's a reward response. So yeah, absolutely, it can become an addiction. Sorry, let me go down here. I see one more. Great. What do I feel about the narcissistic parent? I don't know if narcissistic parents become codependent. Do you? Can a narcissistic person be an enabler? Because I see people who are narcissistic are really, invested in themselves, and they're very slow to see the needs of others as being important. So that becomes a different topic for me. They violate boundaries, they gaslight, they manipulate. Yeah, so I go back to what am I attached to? What am I afraid of? And am I okay having some discomfort in this? And then I still want to violate the boundaries. So if there's a person, whether they're narcissistic or not, if they're violating boundaries and I continue to stay in that relationship, that's not on them, in my opinion. If they're violating boundaries, it's my job to say, no, that's not okay for me. And I need to, basically, I love you and I need to separate from this relationship for a while, or from your manipulative characteristics. So I see what's going on. And so somebody who's gaslighting or manipulating won't necessarily, and a narcissist certainly wouldn't admit to it, right? They wouldn't admit that they're doing this thing to someone else. So in that, I would gracefully bow out of that relationship, because if they continue to violate boundaries and I don't do anything, that is on me, and that's what I have to take ownership of. And by the way, that happens a lot in addiction or families with addiction, and people stay in relationships for years, even after proven over and over that they will get disappointed or neglected or manipulated or whatever. So people stay in those relationships, and it's really a harsh, some people might see it as harsh, but I'm like, if someone is doing something that I don't agree with and they continue doing it after I've tried to talk to them about it, then it's my job. That's a great question, by the way, because that's really the crux of the whole thing is, can I figure out what I am willing to do and what I'm not willing to do, and can I hold those boundaries? So now we're not talking about boundaries with other people, right? We're talking about boundaries with ourselves. Can I hold the boundaries I make for myself? So I appreciate you all being here. If there's anything else, I will be back on August 11th, and we'll kind of talk about how this relates to relapse prevention. And I thank you all for your time very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rein, for taking the time for this tonight. And just a reminder to all of our attendees tonight, check your email boxes tomorrow for a YouTube link and a copy of the presentation, and come back for the next one in August.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone.